The CIA has long been rumored to have played a role in the rise of Fidel Castro. In fact, the agency did supply some financial support to the Cuban leader during his early years in power. The knowledge that President Eisenhower had of this funding is unclear, and the current understanding is that the CIA operated in this activity on their own. Tens of thousands of dollars were reportedly given to key members of Castro's Marxist allies to fund their takeover of the country. Often, the communist takeover of Cuba is glossed over, as the topic is overshadowed by the Cuban Missile Crisis. Fidel Castro was a popular lawyer and avid critic of the American-backed regime of Batista, as well as a prominent figure in the protests against the American puppet regime. The United States had already staged a coup in Cuba to put Batista into power. However, his actions to oppress the workers of Cuba, in the name of quelling communism, had the opposite effect than he intended. In 1953, Fidel Castro led the beginning of an armed conflict in Cuba against Batista. The CIA supported both sides of the conflict, and Batista would only pour gas on the fire by killing thousands of communist sympathizers. The United States likely viewed Batista as an ineffective puppet and saw Castro as a more favorable marionette. However, Castro was opportunistic and realized that under the thumb of Uncle Sam, he would always be restricted, but by allying with the Soviet Union, he would become a vital asset to be appeased at all costs. Castro gained full power in Cuba in 1959 after overthrowing Batista completely, and though the CIA saw Castro as a potential ally in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, and thus provided him with some financial and military support, they potentially saw that they could use Castro for another aspiration. Relations between the United States and Cuba quickly soured as the Cuban leader began nationalizing American-owned businesses and aligning himself with the Soviet Union. In 1961, the CIA attempted to overthrow Castro in the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a complete failure. The CIA continued to try and undermine Castro throughout the 60s and 70s, including attempted assassinations. However, these efforts only served to solidify Castro's grip on power. This could potentially be the end of the story, a tale of American hubris being undermined by opportunistic underlings. But like all history, things become more complex the deeper you dig.
The CIA glow in the dark. You can see them if you're driving. You just run them over. That's what you do.
The Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, was founded in 1947 to help the United States gain an advantage in the Cold War. The CIA conducted espionage operations against the Soviet Union and its allies, often with the help of defectors or exiles. The agency also worked to influence public opinion in the West, planting stories in the media and funding anti-communist organizations. The CIA's activities during the Cold War were often controversial. The agency was accused of meddling in foreign elections and overthrowing democratically elected governments. In most cases, these allegations are true. The CIA often worked with fascists to further their goals, aiding Imperial Japanese sympathizers in the Philippines, Pinochet's fascist regime in Chile, as well as the Ayatollah in Iran during the Reagan administration. The CIA also began to drift from the original intentions of the United States government as early as in the Truman administration, with the former president even going as far to say, "I would never have agreed to the formulation of the Central Intelligence Agency back in '47 if I had known it would become the American Gestapo." The CIA operated and continues to operate much differently than most think. The agency is very factionalized and is filled to the brim with competing cliques with different aspirations and goals. Examples include infighting leading to the MKUltra project exposing CIA misconduct to the U.S. Senate, leading to restrictions on their conduct in turn, as well as certain factions having ties to the Kennedy assassination. More recently, infighting on the use of torture against al-Qaeda members also put the agency in a tough spot. Edward G. Lansdale was a prominent CIA figure, known for promoting fascist sympathizers in Southeast Asia during the Cold War, and oversaw CIA activity in Cuba during the Kennedy administration. Notably, he was in charge of the Bay and Pigs invasion, which led to his firing by Kennedy. However, his faction remained under his influence within the CIA and is widely attributed to be part of the Kennedy assassination. Lansdale was a believer in turning beliefs against his enemies in order to push his goals, using religious beliefs to do so during his time in Asia. These types of strategies align suspiciously with the activity under the Castro regime after his rise to power. During the Cold War, a pseudo-religious revival took place within the United States, with the church becoming staunchly anti-socialist. This was aided by American neo-Nazis using Christianity as a cover to spread fascism among American Christians. These figures gave rise to the modern Christian ultranationalist movement, and many are still alive and continue to promote these ideals to this day. Despite original scripture promoting otherwise, these groups take an extreme stance against homosexuality and transgenders, and they sought to expand their views. Fascists often worked with so-called communists, such as the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and in the New World, Christian fascists would spread their ideals among Latin American communists. The CIA would pay to use missionaries to promote anti-feminist and anti-LGBT values among Marxist groups in Latin America, which is already the most Catholic region on Earth. Brazil, Panama, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico were the main targets of these operations. While the Carter administration would stop these actions by the CIA, the damage had already been done. Fidel Castro had already been long influenced by Lansdale's CIA, and the fascist factionalism appeared to have potential effects on his regime. The CIA is said to have attempted up to 600 assassination attempts on Fidel Castro. CIA agents were embedded in Castro's circle, and many assassination attempts were simply due to strange series of probabilistic occurrences that caused them not to work. Primarily being poisoned objects mysteriously being altered after contact with embedded CIA plants. There appears to be a highly likely probability that a CIA faction wanted to keep Fidel Castro alive for their own goals. Fidel Castro's Cuba would create UMAP camps, which were labor camps for 35,000 homosexuals, transgenders, Jehovah's Witnesses, and those of low economic standing, where they would be forced into slave labor and conversion therapy, as well as deadly forms of torture. Dozens were killed directly by the torture, and nearly 200 allegedly committed suicide, though it is far more likely they were simply killed. Around 10,000 other dissidents were killed before even taken to these camps. Castro would publicly condemn the persecution of gays and Protestants in 1992, and in 2010 he would take responsibility for the persecutions, though, in reality, his government would perform raids on churches and gay bars up to a decade later. These statements were likely made to butter up to Bill Clinton, George Bush, and Barack Obama, and their neoliberal imperialism in the Islamic world, which Cuba participated in under his leadership. The collapse of the Soviet Union would lead to a small decline in CIA influence, and after the death of Fidel Castro, Cuba would begin to make progress in the rights of the citizens of the country. Though Cuba still mistreats its protesters, on September 26, 2022, gay marriage was legalized in Cuba, and the Protestant population in Cuba is now only growing. With the death of Castro, Cuba's last link to CIA fascism ceased to exist, hopefully resulting in an exponentially more free Cuba in the future.
Keep in mind of what your true original gender is, because it's like you're learning about that girl you want to take on a date, young man, or likewise, you feel more comfortable to approach that boy just saying hello that you've been checking out from a distance, young lady. And hopefully in due time or now, each and every one of you will stay straight. You know, girl for boy, boy for girl. Everything else is vice, as said by Dr. Kinsey. Not just for me, not for the big man upstairs, not for your family, but do it for yourself and for the benefits of everyone in the future. Your children, your children's children. And besides, if you stray away from the straight path, it can really jeopardize the entire future of the world and the human race.